So thank you very much for the invitation to come to lovely Nice, to be able to address so many experts and so many knowledge in the e-cigarette field. I must confess that I don't know much about the e-cigarettes per se. I do know a little bit about nicotine and how it does affect the brain and the body, and I was part of developing the nicotine gum. The first time I took it in my fingers was 1975 or 76. I did my dissertation on smoking cessation and nicotine dependence in 1980. Been working in the academia, been working in the pharmaceutical industry with developing a good number of nicotine replacement forms. For some 8 years, I had a private research clinic where I tested a number of substances, not only for smoking, but for other addictions also. Now I am retired, or at least semi-retired. I find myself that there are still things to do, like being here today. So I will talk about nicotine dependence and try to give you an understanding of how come that e-cigarettes already have surpassed the nicotine replacement products that we have had for 30-some years. Yeah, we can use the time a little bit. I know that the first picture doesn't require any time. That's a picture of the tobacco plant, which is a very nice plant and usually get as high as I am. The second picture is about the brain. And I wanted to point out that there are different structures in the brain, and if we have a pleasure center, that is called the nucleus accumbens, and that would show in that picture. So that on that. When I started, and that was in the middle of the 70s, to become interested in tobacco and smoking, it was regarded as a habit, simply a habit. Of course, the producers of cigarettes had no interest to saying something different. The smokers themselves didn't want to be seen as mini addicts of any sort. Smoking was very common. It was sort of the representative population were smoking, professors, teachers, etc., etc. Today, as we know, smoking is becoming, at least in many countries in the West, very marginalized. So the remaining smokers are different in many demographics and also suffering from, you might say, comorbidities, usually of more of a mental kind. So here we go. Cheerio. Thank you. That was the flower and that was the brain, and we don't need to. And of course, it is a habit. It is a very strong habit. And a habit can by itself be also very dependence forming. Nail biting, for example, it's not very easy to give up. And if someone tries to give up, it comes withdrawal symptoms like irritability and anxiety, etc. So also non-pharmacological behaviors can be regarded as dependencies. But when I started and was taught that this is a habit, I relatively quickly realized that my equipment and knowledge doesn't fit with what our reality shows here. So I found that there must be something else operating. There must be a drug element here. And I started to look around, and I found Professor Russell in London that I visited and learned from, and from that onwards I tried to sort of recognize the nicotine, the pharmacological part of the smoking behavior. And that took on very much, and I have on the picture here a book by the Surgeon General from US that was coming out in 1988. And that book was called Nicotine Addiction. It's a very heavy book, about 800 pages or so. So I would say 1988 would be the time when it was clear, bang, tobacco use is regarded as a drug dependence. So it's turned from a habit into a drug dependence. And World Health Organization in their international classification and diseases have recognized tobacco dependence as a disorder, F17. The criteria to diagnose the disorder are these 6, and 3 need to be present for a diagnosis. I'm not going to go into any detail here. What you can see fairly rapidly is that these criteria are very broad and very generic. And so they are because these criteria are the same regardless if a physician wants to diagnose dependence on benzodiazepines, alcohol, or heroin and tobacco. And we in the tobacco world have found that tobacco and nicotine is sort of different to many other drugs. The pharmacodynamics of nicotine is very special. Also, it's a legal drug and used by big parts of the society, so it makes it different. And when I was seeing smokers, helping them to stop in the middle of the 70s, I needed a tool to diagnose the smoker. So how much of your problem is a pharmacological type and a behavioral type? And therefore I developed a questionnaire which has become more used than the official WHO tests for dependence. And the most important question here, at least nowadays, that is this one. How soon after you wake up or raise out of your bed do you take your first cigarette? And of course, if that is 3 minutes, it's very different from if it is 3 hours. And nicotine is largely gone out of the body in the morning. The half-life of nicotine is 2 hours. So if you finish smoking at 10 o'clock in the night before, at 12 o'clock your concentration is halved, at 2 o'clock in the night is halved again and again. So in the morning there is hardly any pharmacologically active concentrations of nicotine left. And if you can go for hours before you take your first administration, whether it's cigarette or snus or e-cigarette, that says that you are not heavily dependent on nicotine, because those who are heavily dependent on nicotine, they are in abstinence when they wake up. As much as many of us need a cup of coffee fairly quickly in the morning, at least to get the brain cells to start working. So time to first cigarette in the morning is the single strongest indicator of dependence. Then you see there are other questions there also, like number of cigarettes, of course, and if you smoke even though you are ill, and difficulties refraining when smoking is not possible or forbidden. On the next slide here, we see that the brain lights up if nicotine is given. This is the control condition. So this we keep for comparison. Here, a dose of nicotine has been given, and you see the brain lights up. And if you increase the dose, it lights up even more. What lights up here, this is the brain is using glucose. We are measuring blood glucose here. The brain is working. It requires fuel, we can say. And there is a little bit of interest here also that it happens in 2 discrete areas. The cortex, the outer layer here, and in the middle of the brain, and this is involving structures we used to refer to as the limbic system. And what does smoking do to people? Yeah, it does have an arousal increasing activity. It helps you to concentrate, to improve memory, etc. But it also have this emotional dampening, taking the edge of the anxiety, the stress, the fear, etc. has an impact on the emotions. And that's what the structures for that we have in the middle there in the limbic system, which actually means emotion in Greek. In order to understand how difficult it can be to give up, let me first remind you that many of you, I suppose maybe even most of you, have some experience with tobacco and nicotine. If you try to remember your very first contact with tobacco, usually a cigarette, I guess you can agree that the very first few puffs, minute amounts of nicotine, not more than 2, 3 deep inhalations, and you had 3 more, and maybe you had some dizziness, and maybe you were feeling bad in many ways, cold sweat, etc. So nicotine has a very strong effect on a naive system. What would have happened that day if you had taken all the nicotine in from what you consumed a whole day 20 years later? Let's say you smoked then 20 cigarettes. If you had smoked 20 cigarettes the first day when you tried, when you were 13 or 14 or whatever, you would have ended up at the critical care unit. Absolutely. So what happens? Yeah, something happens that we call tolerance. And that we can see on this picture, actually. This is pictures of different levels of brain slices. And up here we have a never smoker, and down here we have a smoker. And you can see the difference in colors, and that there is much more blue here, particularly in the periphery. And blue means there is little of something. And something here, that is receptors. We do have nicotinic receptors when we are born, as much as we have receptors for morphine, we have receptors for nicotine. When nicotine is coming into the acetylcholine is the natural ligand substance that goes to this receptor. When we are taking nicotine, nicotine goes to the receptor, parks in the receptor, sits in the receptor, it's taken out of work. So the brain cannot do what it's supposed to do with this system. So the brain then has to adapt as much as if we go to the gym and do some heavy lifting. We have muscle adaptation. Here we have neuro adaptation. We got more neurons, more receptors. So you can smoke 20 cigarettes a day and feel completely normal. But you would not have been normal the first day you tried cigarettes, if you have smoked 20 cigarettes. So the brain is refurnished, it's changed, structural changes. And the brain is sort of made for nicotine. It is adapted to nicotine. And if you then all of a sudden stop nicotine, you have a suboptimal functioning, and it results into withdrawal symptoms. So that's where the trouble comes, and that's where we can have some help with nicotine replacement, and particularly nowadays with electronic cigarettes and also other medicines. Some manage to do this without any help of that kind also. So now, I think I made the case for nicotine. Now I'm going to reverse myself a little bit. Around 5 years ago, I sat back and I came to think that is the nicotine, the role of nicotine actually so strong as we have tried to perpetuate it? I think also many scientists try to be scientists on the same level as those who were dealing with cocaine and heroin, etc., and talking about nicotine, nicotine, nicotine all the time. You see, when we talk about people smoking and studying their smoking, we are looking at a lot of things. Nicotine is one of many, many substances and elements there. And if you look at this critically, there has been absolutely no epidemic of pure nicotine use, as far as I understand, across the world at any time in the world. And it's extremely easy to distill nicotine base at home in your own kitchen. You don't really need any equipment at all. The only thing you need is a little bit of alcohol. So the interest in nicotine doesn't seem to be that big. The efficacy of nicotine replacement, although it's there, it's moderate. And if it was just about nicotine, why wouldn't smokers that we load up so they do have the same dose concentration of nicotine as when they smoked? Why isn't it easy then to give up smoking? Why do they still crave for a cigarette? There are absolutely or virtually no misuse of nicotine replacement. There is no one that starts their addiction on patches or gums. The thieves aren't breaking into the pharmacy and steal nicotine replacement, but they do steal cigarettes. If we look at human self-administration, there are some intravenous studies also. It's not very convincing. They do not work much more for active nicotine compared to placebo. And also in human self-administration of nicotine replacement, the placebo is almost as good as the active. Animals, where that comes, yeah, here, nicotine, you can get animals to self-administer nicotine, but it's under relatively specific circumstances. It's not a strong reinforcer as amphetamine or cocaine. If a smoker is abstinent, at least overnight, and comes into a laboratory, and they can then have nicotine replacement products or a de-nicotinized cigarette, the large majority prefer the de-nicotinized cigarette. And funny enough, when we look at what happens in the brain, more happens in the brain from the de-nicotinized cigarette than the nicotine gum. And this doesn't go on for just one day. They choose day after day the cigarette, even without nicotine, compared to the gum. So here we have to reconcile this. And it's obviously so that tobacco is more than nicotine. And we are starting to realize that there are also some other substances in the tobacco that by themselves are reinforcing in animal studies. Hormone and norhormone, which you find in chocolate, coffee, acetaldehyde, and I show you what happens with acetaldehyde on this picture. This is rats that are pressing a lever, and they can get saline when they press the lever, which is not very interesting, you see. They can get acetaldehyde. It's a little bit more reinforcing than the saline. They can get nicotine, again, a little bit better. Here they get both nicotine and acetaldehyde, and then they really work. So that's much more rewarding. And we have acetaldehyde not only in the tobacco smoke, we also have it in smokeless tobacco. But I suppose, but I'm not sure whether it is in the nicotine you use for e-cigarettes. So dependence, there is dependence to more than chemical substances also. The cigarette as an object and the behavior and the sensory impact, I will come to that a little bit on this slide. If we compare a cigarette with a nicotine patch, with a cigarette, there is plenty of possibility for conditioning. You smoke here and there, those times, those places, together with certain states, moods, and these become signals that elicits your craving condition response to smoke. With a patch, you put it on in the morning and you take it off in the evening. There is virtually no behavior at all. The smoking behavior per se can actually be relaxing. I mean, we all know that deep inhalations is relaxing. And what do you do when you smoke, apart from you buy yourself a little break to think about a difficult problem or something embarrassing, and you take a couple of deep inhalations and exhalations that can be relaxing. Smoking can reduce tension and anxiety. And here we have the nicotine, of course, that is important. And also nicotine delivery to the brain. The patch, which is one extreme of the nicotine replacement formulations then, isn't really constructed to give a hit and a subjective positive effect. It's constructed to sort of lay a certain base level, even base level of nicotine. So you wouldn't come so low in your nicotine concentration that it elicits withdrawal symptoms. But in order to have a subjective positive effect, you need to have something that comes on rapidly. That's why drug addicts aren't eating or drinking their drugs. They try to get them to the brain as fast as possible, simply because if it isn't fast enough, the brain can defend itself. And if you, for example, take X centiliters of alcohol over 2 hours, and you compare that with you take X centiliters over 10 minutes, it's the same volume of alcohol, but the effect is going to be very different. So the speed of delivery, and nothing is more delivering nicotine to the brain more speedy than the cigarette. You inhale, you have it in the lung. From the lung, it goes to the heart, and from the heart to the body, including the brain. And that is about 10, 20 seconds or something that you might have an effect in the brain. With a patch, we would talk about, maybe an hour or so. And I think here you have a picture of the pharmacokinetics of nicotine. So here is the nicotine concentration in the blood, minutes. If we apply a patch here, it will take a long time before you get up to any decent concentrations. The cigarette, you have the peak right at when you stop smoking, which is usually an increase in 12 nanograms of nicotine per milliliter. A 4 milligram gum, a 2 milligram gum, an inhalator, nasal spray is relatively fast but doesn't go high. So the pharmacokinetics is also important. What I would like to say, and I say it now so I don't miss it, in order to understand this phenomenon, when I said that an abstinent smoker rather uses a de-nicotinized cigarette, imagine that you really are longing for a cup of coffee now. It was long ago, and maybe you are a little tired also. A cup of coffee would really be nice. Maybe you are with a good friend also. And I'm coming and saying, I'm sorry we are out of coffee, but I give you a caffeine pill here. And you swallow the pill. You get the same caffeine dose. Will you be relieved of the craving from a cup of coffee? I suppose not. So our brains, they aren't really able to communicate in, I'm craving for vitamins now, I'm craving for carbohydrates now, I'm craving for nicotine now, I'm craving for caffeine. They communicate with objects that we can see, hear, and touch. And that's why it's not so easy to convince a smoker to take a piece of chewing gum. I'm interested in the cigarette. The nicotine gum may give you the nicotine, but the smoking is more than nicotine. I could speak a long time, for smokers are different. I mean, we are all different. We are individuals. And also the smoking, the way we use smoking and the reasons for why we smoke are also different. And when we try to give up, we have different problems. It's not so that smoking cessation means this for everyone. And some of the I'm going to address two here, actually. We are always, when we speak about drug addiction, speaking about positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when something pleasant is added on. For the first time you take a heroin shot, that will become the heroin addict, he gets to the seventh heaven. It's very positive. But after X number of times, there is something else that motivates this heroin user to take another shot. And that is not to get to the seventh heaven. That is to get relief from the withdrawal pain I'm having now. And that is negative reinforcement, to reduce the pain of withdrawal. And there are smokers who smoke mainly for positive reinforcement, as most of us use alcohol, or probably also coffee or caffeine. But there are also smokers that smoke predominantly for the negative reinforcement. I have seen smokers that have complained, I don't even find it taste good. It's a shit. I don't like it. I don't like the smell. It doesn't taste good. So why do you smoke? I can't give up. It's the withdrawal that makes me go on smoking. So they are smoking for negative reinforcement. And it's quite possible that you would need sort of different approaches in terms of pharmacology here also to address them. The other variable that I want to mention, which I think is important, that is that nicotine normalizes nervous activity or arousal. That means that if you are stressed, you are hyper-aroused, you are busy, there is a lot of demand on you, and you take nicotine, the arousal will go down, you will be a little bit calmer. If you are in the other end of the continuum, you are bored, you are tired, there is nothing to do, and you take nicotine, and it increases arousal. So in both cases, it moves you towards the middle. And I think that is a very sort of positive effect of this drug, that, as we used to say, it can stimulate and sedate at the same time. And there is not many drugs that can do that. So nicotine is definitely a very good drug to see. You can do harm reduction with tobacco rather, because nicotine is not what gives you the lung cancer or the cardiovascular disease or the respiratory COPD. It is all the other things that comes particularly with the pyrolysis. So smoking lends itself very well to harm reduction. But what you probably do not know, before I get to that, there is a continuum of harm, which I think you all know and understand. Cigarettes in one end, and the e-cigarettes and nicotine replacement in the other. But what about giving up? The strength of dependence, is there such a continuum also? So what I did was that I looked into the Cochrane system, where all the trials that has been done on smoking cessation, stopping smokeless tobacco, and also stopping long-term dependence on nicotine replacement, and found out what the results were. And I would like then to look at the placebo-treated group to get rid of the active drug effect there. So on this slide, you see that in the smoking cessation trials, 10% were abstinent usually half a year to 1 year after, if they have got a placebo. But they got behavioral interventions and visits and support and so on. For the smokeless trials, the placebo response was 25%. And here we only have one trial, so this is a little bit more shaky. But here, those who got placebo, 36% managed to stop long-term nicotine gum use. So this suggests to me that there not only is there a continuum of harm, there is a continuum of dependence also. So that the most dependence-provoking and difficult to give up, and that is a cardinal symptom of dependence, that is cigarettes. Much easier to give up with smokeless and further easier with the nicotine replacement. So continuum of dependence, we have cigarettes there, we have NRTs here. We have snus, less dependent than cigarettes. But where are the e-cigarettes here? We really don't know, I would say, for the time being. There are some data, and I show you some. This is Farsalinus that got 111 long-term, more than 30 days of e-cigarette users. And he assessed their dependence on the e-cigarette by time to first e-cigarette, and also how they rated their past dependence on smoking compared to the current one on e-cigarettes. And for both of these questions, they said that the dependence to the e-cigarette was lower than the dependence to the traditional cigarette. There are some data also from other studies by Dawkins and Gonewitz that supports this finding. And the more recent and not yet published is by Jonathan Foltz, where he is looking at time to the first e-cigarette after awakening in the morning. And here we have the percent. And this is e-cigarette, and this is the traditional cigarette when they used that. And when they had the traditional cigarettes, what is it, 38% that lighted up within 5 minutes. With the e-cigarettes, it's about 15%. So this again suggests that when transferring to the e-cigarette, the dependence is becoming a bit less, at least. This is my final slide. I think we have to more and more realize that nicotine is one thing and tobacco is one thing. Tobacco is almost only studied in humans. It's very rare that we have animal studies where they are exposed to tobacco smoke or tobacco particulate matter. There are some studies, but not very much. Nicotine is usually investigated in animals. They are injected by pure nicotine. For tobacco, self-administration and initiation is very common. It certainly was as common as half of the population were smokers in many countries, and still 60% of the Russian men are smoking, and initiation is strong. There is very weak self-administration of nicotine in animals, and in humans, we really don't see any initiation of nicotine, pure nicotine, but tobacco. Tobacco and nicotine is different. When smoked, as I mentioned, the nicotine is very uptake, the speed of delivery to the brain is very fast, and also there is more than nicotine, so the other substances are also coming there very fast. With nicotine in the formulations we have had so far with nicotine replacement, the uptake has been much, much slower and less effective for that matter. Tobacco, very harmful to health, particularly smoking. With nicotine, there are few direct harms except in pregnancy. Tobacco products are mostly smoked. Nicotine products have been medicinal products up to now. There is a dependence diagnosis recognized by World Health Organization for tobacco. The dependence seems to be weaker for nicotine than it is to tobacco. Nicotine is the most important reinforcer, but there are others in tobacco. Now the e-cigarette comes here, and is it a tobacco product? Is it a nicotine product? And I think authorities are struggling here also to define whatever it is. And maybe which way you choose is dependent on what you actually think and like to do, if you are for or against. I think I have used my time. There was another slide here also, but it's fascinating for me to see that I've struggled with nicotine replacement products for 30 plus years, and now see that in 4 or 5 years the e-cigarette has overtaken the NRT. There must be something here. There must be an appeal which wasn't there with nicotine replacement. And I think the behavior is important. As much as I said that abstinent smokers rather choose a de-nicotinized cigarette because it is a cigarette and it contains tobacco, relatively the same taste. You have the smoke, you have the scratch in your back, you see the exhalation of smoke, etc. You can play with it, the object looks like. So this is in many ways much closer to the cigarette, and that's what I think is very important. And you have the phenomenon here also that there are e-cigarettes without nicotine that are used. And there are in my country, Sweden, which is the snus country, as you may know, there are also relatively big sales of a snus product without nicotine. So snus users that are used to this sensation, this package, this taste, etc., they also find some reward in a product that are similar in most ways except for nicotine. So nicotine, I would say, is important, but it's not sufficient to create pleasure and dependence. And thereby, I think I'm finished. Thank you very much.